Welcome to the INMM's annual meeting final session, our closing plenary. This week went by really fast, didn't it? I invite you to enter your favorite part in the chat so we can all reflect on what happened during the week. I'm Susan Pepper, president of the INMM, and I want to introduce our moderators for our final session. But first, I have a few announcements. Following our closing plenary, we will announce the winners of our scavenger hunt, poster prizes, and the student paper competition. To attend, just stay in the session. Shortly following this meeting, that is, you'll receive a survey about our annual meeting. And I sincerely hope that you will take the time to answer the questions and provide us with feedback that will help us make future meetings more valuable for you. In particular, give us ideas you have for our meeting in Vienna next year, which will be held, as you know, jointly with ISARDA. And let us know your ideas for the technical program, as well as any cultural or social activities that can enhance the meeting. Just a couple other things I want to tell everyone. On June 1st, you may have heard we launched our new tiered pricing program. It recognizes that nuclear materials managers around the world live in a variety of economic circumstances, and that for some, our membership dues are restrictive. We now have 4 tiers of membership dues for developed countries, for high-income countries, low-income countries, and least developed countries. We need your help in promoting this new program to the members of our community who can benefit from it. So please help us spread the word to your networks. Second, while we work to gain new members, we don't want to lose existing members, especially retirees. You don't have to retire from the INMM when you retire from your job. We have emeritus membership that recognizes the reduced earnings of retirees. All you have to do is fill out a simple application to receive this benefit and remain involved in the INMM. I'd like to thank once more our platinum exhibitor, Oak Ridge National Laboratory. We truly appreciate your continued support. Now to our closing plenary. Our facilitators today are Tina Hernandez and Tariq Rauf. And so now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Tina and Tariq.
So good afternoon. Welcome to the closing plenary of this INMM annual meeting. We're honored to have 3 distinguished speakers who will be covering diverse subjects of interest to the INMM community, such as nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and gender diversity in management positions in the nuclear industry. This year, 2022, is important for major international conferences on nuclear-related matters. Before I proceed further, I'd like to inform that we shall take a few questions following each speaker and try to leave some time before closing for any additional questions. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to post your questions. Full biographies of the speakers are available on the meeting website. Last month in Vienna, the 4th International Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons and the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons were held, both presided over by our first speaker, Ambassador Alexander Kmentt. Next week, the 10th Review Conference of the states parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, postponed from 2020 due to COVID, will be held at the United Nations in New York, to be presided over by Ambassador Gustavo Zlauvinen, our second speaker. Moving to another important contemporary matter, Ms. Dominique Mouillot, our final speaker, will address gender diversity in senior and management positions in the nuclear industry and in nuclear governance. Now I would like to introduce Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, who is the Director of the Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Department of the Austrian Federal Ministry for European and International Affairs. He served as president of the 2022 Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons, and also of the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, both held in Vienna last month. From 2016 to 2019, Ambassador Kmentt was the permanent representative of Austria to the Political and Security Committee of the European Union. During his career, he has worked extensively on disarmament issues, including at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and at the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna. Alexander is one of the architects of the Initiative on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons and also of the TPNW. He was responsible for the 2014 Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons, for which he conceived the humanitarian pledge that garnered the support of 135 states and paved the way for the 2017 TPNW. During a sabbatical from 2019 to 2020, as senior research fellow at King's College London, Alexander wrote the book, The Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons, How It Was Achieved and Why It Matters, published by Routledge. He received the Simons Foundation Canada Award for Distinguished Global Leadership in the Service of Peace and Disarmament. And in 2014, he was elected Arms Control Person of the Year by the Washington-based Arms Control Association. Alexander Kmentt holds an Austrian law degree and an MPhil in International Relations from Cambridge University. With this introduction, may I now invite Ambassador Kmentt for his comments.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to address this closing plenary. I have to admit that I was very pleased to receive this invitation to speak about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I take this to be a positive sign of growing readiness to engage constructively with the TPNW, even though there may be quite divergent perspectives on the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. I think it's also a sign of recognition that the TPNW, with which one can, of course, disagree, that it is now a treaty in force and that it cannot and should not be ignored. It's a new addition to the multilateral nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, and the health of this regime is at the end of the day, of course, very important to all of us. I thought quite a bit in the past few days about how I should approach this presentation and how to make good use of the opportunity that you have given me. So I assume that all of you are very familiar with the nuclear weapons issue and that you follow the global nuclear weapons related discussions, specifically also the NPT, very closely. But I assume, and I hope I'm right, that the perspective from which you follow this discussion may be predominantly one of states that either possess nuclear weapons or that are in nuclear that are under nuclear cooperation and nuclear umbrella arrangements. So I thought it might be useful to speak about the nuclear weapons issue from the perspective of states that do not have these weapons and that do not rely on nuclear weapons, because maybe most of you may not be so closely familiar with this perspective. Now, of course, 150 UN member states fall into this category. And their perspective on nuclear weapons has so far been mostly neglected to a large extent in the treaty frameworks that we have and in the NPT in particular. Of course, I cannot assume to speak for these states. I make my remarks in my personal capacity only, but I'm quite confident that my observations are broadly in line with the perspectives on nuclear weapons that most of these states have. So I thought I would try to explain these perspectives and the motivations behind the TPNW, which includes, of course, in my view, very pertinent and legitimate security considerations that underpin the TPNW. And then finally, I will speak briefly about the recently concluded first meeting of states parties, and I hope that all of this will be informative for you. Let me start with a few figures. 66 states have now ratified the TPNW, 86 have signed it, 122 states adopted the treaty in 2017, 128 states supported the TPNW resolution in the General Assembly last year, 135, as Tariq has just mentioned, supported the humanitarian pledge that paved the way for the TPNW, and 159 states co-signed a cross-regional statement on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons in 2015. And I'm highlighting these numbers to demonstrate that the support for the arguments on which the TPNW is built is much higher than the current number of ratifications and signatures of this young treaty. That the perspectives on nuclear weapons that are now enshrined in the TPNW and the rationale on which this treaty is built are very widely shared in the international community. But what exactly are these arguments and perspectives? There's firstly looking at humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And the TPNW and the humanitarian initiative that started this process does it from a different perspective than the nuclear deterrence one. Because the nuclear deterrence perspective has the underlying assumption that nuclear weapons will not be used because nuclear deterrence will hold. We looked at what happens if nuclear weapons are used and exploded. And we looked at the short, medium, and long-term consequences, and there is now plenty of evidence in peer-reviewed scientific research on the transboundary global level of consequences which are far more serious than previously assumed. And the interconnectedness and the interrelationship of these consequences are even hardly understood and studied. You may be familiar with, for example, the studies predicting a potential global famine as a result of a limited nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan, with equally devastating global economic disruption, mass migration movements the world has never seen. So if there is a conflict between two states, nuclear states in one region of the world, leading to dramatic consequences globally and in completely other parts of the world, this of course raises important questions of international law and of the legitimacy of a system that imposes these threats and consequences on the entire world. Secondly, there's the dimension of risks. We understand more today about past near misses, accidents, miscommunications. We understand how often we essentially lucked out in the past during the Cold War. We understand that new technologies, such as potential vulnerability of cyber hacking, artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, and other developments add very serious new risk drivers to the nuclear weapons sphere. So there is again evidence to underpin this. So the TPNW makes the case to juxtapose the evidence that we have on the combination of both humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons with the arguments that nuclear weapons do provide security. And it asks the question, of course, what kind of security and whose security we are talking about. So there's a lot of uncertainty, no question about this on either side of the argument, and there are a lot of assumptions. But there are very important questions of legitimacy, and there's also the dimension of realism versus idealism. The TPNW makes the case that nuclear deterrence is based on assumptions, that it cannot be proven. Its effectiveness cannot be proven because one cannot prove a negative. And even if it works in one case, one doesn't know and doesn't have any guarantee that nuclear deterrence would work again in another constellation, in another context. So the uncertainties and assumptions that underpin nuclear deterrence need to be weighed against the empirically demonstrable humanitarian consequences and risks that are potentially borne by all humanity. The TPNW also makes the case that it is naive to think that nuclear threats will remain nuclear threats only. And we see the precariousness of this system right in front of our eyes right now. We actually see it encouraging aggressive behavior and brinkmanship. TPNW makes thus a realist case, puts forward a realist and rational case for nuclear disarmament, one that is not naive or that is not an argument of the peace movement, but one that is based on security, on international law and legitimacy arguments that are very broadly shared in the international community. The TPNW also looks at nuclear weapons, the status quo, from an aggregate perspective, looking at the collective practice of nuclear deterrence as practiced by 9 states and their allies that create unacceptable security risks for the rest of the world. So it points to valid security concerns of non-nuclear weapon states, and these arguments give agency to non-nuclear weapon states, and the TPNW is the result of this agency. So At the very least, the TPNW raises profound issues that need to be addressed much more broadly in a more democratic and more inclusive debate about security and the legitimacy of the current nuclear weapons status quo. So we should at least see more serious engagement on these arguments and the perspectives that are so widely shared in the international community. The TPNW has been painted as all sorts of things, as undermining the NPT, as a deficient treaty, as naive, as dangerous, as divisive. And all of these are politically motivated arguments. In reality, the TPNW is the result of decades-long neglect of the valid perspectives of most non-nuclear weapon states and of a feeling of disenfranchisement on the nuclear weapons issue. But at the same time, it is also a reflection of the growing concern held by many states about the multilateral nuclear regime and the direction of travel with regard to nuclear weapons, because there is another perspective that is widely shared among those 150 non-nuclear weapon states. It is that the nuclear armed states and nuclear weapon states are not implementing their obligations and commitments on nuclear disarmament in a sufficiently credible manner. True, there may be differences in the approaches of the nuclear weapon states and in their sincerity, but all nuclear weapon states are modernizing their arsenals, and none of them show any serious movement towards actually wanting to move away from a reliance on nuclear weapons. So the alleged shared goal of a world without nuclear weapons is increasingly seen as hollow words, adding to a fundamental credibility challenge for the NPT. And I would say that most non-nuclear weapon states would also consider this lack of progress on Article 6 to be at least as equally damaging to the credibility of the NPT as some of the non-proliferation challenges that we see. A brief couple of words on the first meeting of states parties that was concluded last month. It was a very substantive meeting. The overall objective of states parties was to demonstrate that this is a serious undertaking. So it was serious, it was substantive, it was open expertise from civil society, academia, and experts. And it underscored the complementarity of the TPNW with the regime. It took a number of important decisions that were diligently prepared over well over a year. So the TPNW is here to stay. And I think that after this first meeting of states parties and the way this meeting was conducted and how substantive it was, must be considered as now firmly established. We developed an action plan, which I encourage you to look at. It concludes some novel aspects, specifically with respect to the positive obligations in the TPNW on the assistance to victims and environmental remediation from past nuclear weapons explosions. Just want to highlight that we have a number of states parties that are to this day very seriously affected by past nuclear weapons testing campaigns, Kazakhstan and the Pacific Island states, for example. And we adopted a strong political declaration, which I believe is the strongest multilateral document on nuclear disarmament that was ever negotiated. It contains a clear repudiation of nuclear threats in any form whatsoever and of nuclear deterrence. And it is the expression of the perspective of non-nuclear weapon states that I've mentioned before, and I would encourage you to read it. So hopefully after the first meeting of states parties and after the NPT review conference that we are heading off to, I hope that at least some of the antagonism against the TPNW will start to fall away. When we see the entire nuclear regime as challenged as it is right now, and Russia's illegal and reckless actions have added further very serious layers of challenges, and we don't even understand these challenges quite yet. But in a situation as it is right now, I hope that some of the TPNW skeptics would ask themselves the question whether it is a good thing or a bad thing that there are states that are investing into the multilateral regime and that are willing to take on additional legal obligations against nuclear weapons. I would argue that the regime needs as much reinforcement as possible. And I hope that we will see much more constructive engagement with the TPNW and its very profound underlying arguments and rationale. And this would be important to address some of the credibility issues that the nuclear weapons regime is facing right now. And I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Kmentt, for your views on the dangers and risks of nuclear weapons and the need for making further progress on nuclear disarmament and risk reduction. So one of the questions we'd like to put to you is the following. At the NPT review conference starting next week, how could friction be minimized between the supporters and the opponents of the TPNW? And how might this issue be dealt with in a way that it does not become a distraction from the main discussions at the NPT? And you might recall that at a recent meeting, one of the nuclear weapon states advised that there's no need to be so aggressive against the TPNW. So your comments.
Thank you. I actually don't see this as a problem at all. The NPT is a review conference, so we are supposed to look back at what happened in the past few years. Obviously, the TPNW is something relevant that has happened in the past few years. We should be able to find a formulation that is factual, that does not implicate anyone who does not want to be implicated. We are well familiar with this kind of drafting, so I don't think that that should be a problem. However, we also need to speak about the things that actually happen. So it did happen. So I don't think that that's a problem. On the other aspect, I don't think the TPNW in any way can be a distraction, because the arguments that we have put forward very clearly is that the TPNW itself, joining the TPNW, is the strongest expression of support for the NPT, for both nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. The states that are supportive of the TPNW are among the staunchest supporters of the NPT. We will make our points to strengthen the different pillars of the NPT as we have done in the past. So I maybe the aspect that could come out strongly from the humanitarian conference and the first meeting of states parties is wanting to put even more focus on the humanitarian consequences aspect and risks. But again, here I think it should be possible to find a way forward. I would say that the NPT REFCON faces much more pertinent problems right now as to how to deal with the TPNW. I do not see this to be a problem at all, to be honest.
Thank you, Alexander. I'd like to ask my co-moderator, Tina Hernandez, if there were any questions posted by the audience.
I don't have any questions posted by the audience. At this time, I would like to encourage folks to put some questions in the Q&A for Ambassador Kmentt, and he will address those. And so, Tariq, did you have another question you wanted to ask?
Yes, I'll ask Alexander another question, which you've been asked many times before, Alexander. The critics say that the TPNW contradicts or undermines the NPT, also that it does not include a verification system for the implementation of the TPNW.
Indeed, I have been asked this question many times before. The complementarity issue was one of the key aspects that we addressed at the first meeting of states parties. We have a working paper that was negotiated and represents consensus among the TPNW membership, which very clearly sets out the case for the complementarity of the TPNW with the wider regime and the NPT in particular. We always considered this to be a purely politically motivated set of points, and we basically wanted to conclude this discussion once and for all by having a very unequivocal position. So anyone who continues to make these points, I would encourage to have a look at this document. However, if these points are made again, we have an agreed position now as TPNW states parties how to respond. I think it's a particularly unhelpful set of arguments. And I always also refer to the point that these arguments are made by some of the states whose own implementation record on Article 6 is not as full as it should be, whereas the record in support of the NPT of the states that have been most actively promoting the TPNW is very strong. I would just encourage you to look at, for example, South Africa. That's actually the only state that has developed a nuclear weapons program and gave it up and joined the NPT as a non-nuclear weapons state. Mexico, that has led the entire continent into the nuclear weapons free zone. Kazakhstan, that has given up its nuclear weapons. Ireland, that has essentially invented the NPT. My own country also has, I think, a very strong record on this issue, and the list could go on. So I think it's an unhelpful set of arguments. On the verification issue, I think it's been very clearly set out from the beginning that the TPNW is a prohibition treaty, similar as the Biological Weapons Convention, that is also a prohibition treaty. As you will recall, the Biological Weapons Convention also doesn't have a verification protocol, and the value of the prohibition contained in the Biological Weapons Convention is not put into question. We have, however, foreseen a pathway in the TPNW, and we have made it very clear that, of course, verification is extremely important, but we did not want to negotiate detailed verification measures in a treaty negotiations that was boycotted by the states that actually have these weapons. So we foresee these detailed negotiations, and we are going to be ready for them by the time any of the nuclear armed states are ready to embark on this. So it's again a hollow set of arguments which continue to be made, but that I think I also hope that this will slowly fall away with time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tina, any questions coming up?
Yes, Ambassador, thank you very much. So is there any thoughts of adding the additional protocol in some way to the TPNW?
Well, the additional protocol, as you know, is a voluntary instrument. We have tried in the IAEA, and we have had discussions for many years, whether or not it should be legally binding in the agency. And this discussion has not concluded in the agency, and it's equally inconclusive in the TPNW. However, the TPNW makes it very clear that states that join the TPNW cannot retract from the safeguard standard that they have when they join the TPNW. And for the vast majority of states, parties of the TPNW, this includes the additional protocol. So for those states in the TPNW, the additional protocol has been significantly strengthened. So it's not a fair accusation against the TPNW, because the issue of the additional protocol is one that's in the agency, and it hasn't been concluded in the agency. So it's also the same arguments are being made in the TPNW as well.
I have one more question, and it's regarding the steps that can be taken to engage the nuclear weapons states. What's your recommendation there?
Well, first of all, the engagement has to be mutual. The lack of engagement, the disengagement, has not come from the states that have supported and promoted the TPNW. It's been from the get-go been boycotted, unfortunately, by the states that have these weapons. I recall the coordinated statement of the nuclear weapon states of why they would not attend the first humanitarian conference in Oslo. So from the very get-go, there was disengagement. So the door on the TPNW was always open. And of course, we know, TPNW states parties know that the objectives of the treaty will be achieved only through dialogue. We cannot force anyone to give up these weapons. So we are going to do this through the force of the argument. We have agreed in our action plan on a number of, under the chapter of universalization, which of course needs to be interpreted in a broad way. It's not merely counting or bringing in new countries on board, but it's actually promoting the arguments on which the treaty is based, which is the focus on humanitarian consequences and risks. And I have to say that so far we have seen very little engagement on this. We have seen rather criticisms against the treaty. And I would say that part of this is a deliberate tactic, because it is simply easier to criticize the treaty than it is to actually have a discussion on the humanitarian consequences and risks, because of course these very profound questions and legitimacy issues that are the basis of this are very hard to answer for some of the nuclear armed states. So I hope that they understand that the TPNW states parties are serious, and that we have a constructive view of dialogue, and that we will see more engagement on these very profound points in the future.
So, Ambassador Kmentt, I'm going to just expand on that same question. As you know, with NPT, there was always a carrot for the non-nuclear weapon states. So, how would you say that could be practiced for, the disengagement be brought to the table? So, the fact that there is the states who are practicing disengagement, how could they be brought to the table for negotiations?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that really well.
Yeah, I think the question is, how can the states who practice disengagement be brought to the table for negotiation? So the states that you're saying are not engaging, what are the carrots that you can provide to help them with that, bring them to the table for those negotiations? It's just
I'm not necessarily talking about negotiations. I'm talking about raising these very pertinent issues and having the discussion on the security, the actual security value of these weapons and of the system of nuclear deterrence in all available frameworks. So we have the opportunity to do this from next week on for 4 weeks. We can do this in Geneva, which we do. We can do it in the general, in the GA this autumn. We saw, which was interesting for the first meeting of states parties, a sort of late surge of participation as observers of some of NATO member states, which we felt was very welcome, which was a sign of readiness to engage. And I hope that they went away from the meeting in Vienna understanding that their participation and presence was actually welcomed. There was no antagonism. It was a sign of respect towards the treaty, and that was reciprocated. So I think it is the carrot that you mentioned is that we have a regime that is in extreme dire straits, and here we have a constructive group of states that is investing into this regime and has been boycotted so far. So it is absolutely up to the states that have held this view to slowly change their mind. And we will continue to make our points. And I'm optimistic that sooner or later, the policy of antagonism and ignoring is changing. And I have to say, I think we are already seeing some of this, which is really welcome. And of course, the situation is different since the treaty is in force, because it now is a reality under international law. And I think in many capitals, there is a discussion on how to find a way to deal with this. We have done nothing in the preparation for the first meeting of states parties to close the door, and we will continue not to do anything to close the door. So I think it's up to the states that have held this position so far to slowly come around and start engaging.
Thank you so much. And I think that was a great end to your very, very informative talk. We're going to move on to the next speaker.
and that is going to be Ambassador Gustavo Zlauvinen, and he's the president designate of the 10th NPT Review Conference. He has served as the Deputy Minister of Argentina in 2019, Undersecretary for Foreign Policy from 2016 to 18, and the Director General of the International Organizations from 2015 to 2018, among other high positions at the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs. From 2001 to 2009, he was the representative of the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency to the United Nations in New York. And from 1995 to 1999, he served as political advisor and chef de cabinet of the United Nations Special Commissions on verification of destruction of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. He was the chair of the working group on preventing and responding to weapons of mass destruction attacks of the UN Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force in New York. From 1993 to 1996, he was a rapporteur of the Standing Committee on Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage. During his extensive diplomatic service, Ambassador Zlauvinen has served as a representative of Argentina to a number of disarmament, nuclear energy, and arms control conference and meetings, including the IAEA Board of Governors and General Conference, the United Nations General Assembly's First Committee, the NPT review process, the Conference on the Adoption of the Nuclear Safety Convention, and the Committee of the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, among others. Ambassador Zlauvinen has provided us with a pre-recorded talk with questions that will be addressed following his talk and that he will address at the end. One thing I wanted to note is, I know Ambassador Zlauvinen really did want to be here, but as you can imagine, the review conference is coming up and he's been very busy leading that. So the questions that will be addressed by Ambassador Zlauvinen in the talk will be, how do you think the postponement of the REFCON from 2020 to 2022 will affect the circumstances of the meeting and its outcome? Will there be any positive or negative effects? When you spoke at the INMM meeting in 2020, you mentioned your work with the Better Together Forum. What do you see as the most important issues related to diversity in the nuclear field in attracting the next generation to continue to shepherd the nuclear industry into the future? What are the potential consequences of the war in Ukraine on the future of the NPT? Will the Russian invasion prompt other states to consider nuclear weapons as a deterrent to a more powerful threatening neighbors? So one of the things you'll notice is Ambassador Zlauvinen will go straight from his 14-minute talk into the questions. And so we will post the questions into the chat. And so you'll be able to follow along as he addresses those questions. With that, I'm going to ask BFairs to play the video, please.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad that you're all able to attend. Today, I'm going to be talking about how we are able to have passive gamma ray spectrometers and cameras everywhere, and they're passively deployed.
Wrong presentation. Sorry about that. As with any of these virtual meetings, I'm sure you've realized that we always have some technical difficulties that we're dealing with, but we'll get the right video up in just a second.
Tina, there was another question in the Q&A that maybe we could address while they're finding the right video.
Thank you. Okay, Ambassador Kmentt, if I could have you turn on your video again. So you mentioned that the Biological Convention was not having a verification regime. In fact, it is something the BWC is frequently criticized for. With that in mind, do you contemplate amending the TPNW to include a verification mechanism? And I think you addressed that earlier as well, but I think it'd be great for you to kind of comment on that again, please, in more detail. Ambassador Kmentt? Ambassador Kmentt, can I have you comment on that last question?
I'm sorry, I was just out of the room briefly. Please, please.
Oh, no problem. It was just, oh yeah, no problem. If I could have you turn your video on. The question was regarding the BWC and how it's often criticized for not having a verification regime. You know, with that in mind, how would you envision the verification mechanism for the TPNW to be?
So I've taken my tie off in the meantime, as you can see.
Yeah, no worries.
The TPNW, as I said, has been conceived as a prohibition treaty, but it provides a pathway for nuclear armed states to join if they, so they can join by first getting rid of their weapons, have this verified, or to join and then through a process have the verified elimination of these weapons. We call it join and disarm, or disarm and join. So that's the pathway that is foreseen. It doesn't go further than that because I explained that we did not want to negotiate detailed verification measures without nuclear armed states being there. So it is foreseen for future additional instruments to complement the TPNW. The TPNW also foresees the establishment of a competent international authority or authorities to oversee the elimination of these weapons once nuclear armed states join. However, the political reality is as it is that none of these states is at the moment ready to join. So what the decision that we have taken at the first meeting of states parties is to work on this issue in the intersessional period in a very detailed way. We need to understand what the mandate of such an authority would have to be, what the competences would have to be, what is out there in terms of existing expertise, what is out there in terms of expertise in past processes, past experiences. So this is a decision that the TPNW states parties take very seriously, but it is not one that needs to be taken in a rushed way. So we are very serious about the importance of verification, but it is a process that has only just started. So maybe that's the answer that I can give at that moment.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I think, you know, one thing that has been in the center in the news is the latest war in Ukraine. And a lot of people have stated that, you know, if Ukraine had kept their nuclear weapons, they wouldn't have been invaded. And can you just kind of expand on that and that on that phrase when it comes to the TPNW? Because, you know, those are contradictory in terms of what the TPNW is seeking to achieve and, you know, what the security implications are in Ukraine right now.
Well, the argument that this Ukraine argument is a bit misleading because, as you know, Ukraine, first of all, never had its own nuclear weapons. It had Soviet nuclear weapons that were left in its territory. Ukraine never actually had the effective control, never had the launch codes. There was also clearly a consensus in the 1990s that the breakup of the Soviet Union should not lead to a proliferation of nuclear weapon states. So giving up or sending over the nuclear weapons to Russia was a very broadly supported political choice for Ukraine to be included into the international community as a respected country. Had Ukraine chosen a different path, Ukraine would be a different country. So I think there is a direct linkage being made that doesn't actually quite work that way. I think it is also difficult to make the argument that what we're seeing in Ukraine is, or as a result of Russia's aggression and Russia's nuclear threat, is an unequivocal validation of the virtues of nuclear deterrence. We see nuclear weapons being used to coerce, and I think we see mostly the precariousness of that construct in front of our eyes. And I think the repercussions, what it means for the theory of nuclear deterrence, will be discussed in our bubble for many months and many years, because we see a highly risky situation. We probably see that sort of different people who sit on different sides of the arguments see what they see as a validation for their line of reasoning. But I think what we're seeing right now raises more questions about nuclear weapons than it answers. So I don't know if this answers your question. I wasn't quite prepared for that question, but I hope I've given sort of an answer.
That was fantastic. I think it gives that historical context that's really important. So I think we should be ready with the next video with Ambassador Zlauvinen. So I'm going to go turn it over to VFairs and have them play the video. And hopefully it won't be about gamma rays.
Is it okay to have the same presentation?
All right, we're good.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to address the annual meeting of the Institute for Nuclear Materials Management. Over the past 6 decades, the INMM has made an important contribution to the safe and peaceful uses of nuclear energy. I commend the Institute for the way in which it continues to raise awareness, bring experts together, engage in cross-sectional activities, and create standards for best practice. All these activities help strengthen the global regime that spans the 3 pillars of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT: disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful use of nuclear energy. The Institute's focus on a more peaceful world is a welcome one. This is, after all, the ultimate goal of the NPT: to create a more peaceful world, one in which the dangers posed by nuclear weapons do not exist. I also want to thank the INMM for its focus on safety and security. Earlier this month, the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs and the International Atomic Energy Agency convened 2 webinars on the role of safety and security in the implementation of the NPT. One of the most important outcomes from these webinars was the reaffirmation of the enabling role played by safety and security in the implementation of the NPT, especially the non-proliferation regime and the frameworks for the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology. Recent events have focused attention on these issues as the world has been forced to confront, for the first time, the challenges posed by nuclear safety and security in a zone of armed conflict. I have no doubt this is something that the 10th NPT Review Conference will need to address. For more than half a century now, the NPT has been a bulwark of international peace and security, and a key facilitator of the benefits of nuclear energy. Over its 52 years history, the treaty has proven itself remarkably resilient and adaptable. These are hallmarks that it will need to display once again as we finally approach the drop zone for the 10th Review Conference. As a consequence of the geopolitical turmoil rocking our world, the NPT faces a raft of challenges, the diversity and scope of which are unlike anything that has come before. Despite this, I believe the state parties are up to the task of pulling off a successful, meaningful review conference. I say this because throughout the eternity that have been the president designate, one thing continues to stand out: state parties' commitment to the NPT and to what it stands for, and their belief that the review conference is not an opportunity to be squandered. The fact that we are finally holding the review conference is a testament to the value the state parties ascribe to it. Due to the dreadful COVID-19 pandemic, the NPT has been postponed 4 times since March 2020. State parties' persistence in making sure that the review conference will be held speaks volumes about the conference status as the de facto multilateral negotiating forum on all things related to nuclear weapons and its role as a pillar of international peace and security. When it comes to the key issues for state parties leading into the review conference, have consistently said that content of any outcome is not my responsibility and must be decided by state parties. Having said that, after many rounds of informal consultations, I do have some insight into priorities, as well as my own personal views. As far as priorities go, the implementation of the treaty's provisions is front and center for many, if not most. Ensuring fulfillment of the treaty's core commitments and obligations is seen as essential to the treaty's enduring success. For many, this is especially the case for disarmament commitments, including those made at prior review conferences, such as the unequivocal undertaking to eliminate nuclear arsenals. Trying to find an acceptable mechanism that will improve accountability for the implementation of existing commitments is likely to be an important consideration for the review conference. From my own perspective, I remain hopeful that state parties will be able to reaffirm their commitment to the treaty as a whole and to the obligations they have assumed as state parties. Given current global conditions and recent events, it should be no surprise that concerns have only grown regarding the need for urgent action under Pillar 1 of the treaty, which is nuclear disarmament. A large group of state parties have stressed the need to agree on near-term risk reduction measures, such as strengthened crisis communications, enhanced transparency measures, and a return to dialogue. Such measures are needed to reverse dangerous trends, increase confidence, and ensure that mistakes or miscalculations do not lead to escalation and catastrophe. Many others, however, have argued that risk reduction is not enough. They believe that circumstances demand immediate action on irreversible and verifiable nuclear disarmament. This will likely include calls for strong language on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, as well as new agreements to reduce the global number of nuclear weapons. Resolving divisions over the pace and scale of nuclear disarmament will be an important task for state parties if the review conference is to achieve a consensus outcome. The norm against the use of nuclear weapons is one of the most important achievements of the post-World War II era, but it is increasingly threatened. From my own perspective, I hope that state parties see the review conference as a unique opportunity to reinforce that norm and, at the same time, reaffirm the collective commitment to the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. On non-proliferation issues, there is broad agreement about the need to strengthen the non-proliferation regime against an array of emerging challenges. One such challenge is to ensure that the safeguard system enforced by the IAEA is fit for purpose, so that it can, for example, respond to technological developments that could potentially circumvent safeguards, such as the so-called dark web, or the unintended uses of technologies such as additive manufacturing. The reverse side of this issue is how to utilize the review conference to facilitate use of technologies that can strengthen non-proliferation. From the use of machine learning for verification to applying distributed ledger technology for nuclear accountancy, there are numerous ways in which technology can work for us. Assisting the resolution of regional proliferation challenges also remains a high priority for state parties. From the Middle East to the Northeast Asia, the introduction of nuclear weapons into any regional conflicts will imply the dangers and amplify the danger by an order of magnitude. State parties are all too aware that failure to address these cases weakens the entire non-proliferation regime. As I'm sure participants will be aware, nuclear propulsion for submarines will likely be divisive at the review conference. The gap between positions on propulsion is wide, but the review conference does present a chance to have an open and technical conversation about the topic that can hopefully move the issue forward. Finally, under Pillar 2, I have heard many calls for the review conference to support the proper resourcing of the IAEA, both in terms of human and financial capital, to carry out its mission. This is in addition to the desire to see the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement universalized, something I believe all state parties want to see happen as soon as possible. Moving to Pillar 3 of the treaty and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, I could not be happier with the ways the parties have approached this issue. Facilitating access to the benefits of nuclear science and technology has long been one of my passions. As the role of nuclear technology becomes more and more prominent in areas from agriculture to medicine, ensuring the widest possible reach of those benefits becomes increasingly important, especially as a catalyst for fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. Have been more than pleasantly surprised by how many state parties, especially state parties from the developing world, have voiced their support for the review conference to endorse a strategy to expand access to not only the technology, but also the know-how to use it and sustain it, and to be a part of its innovation. Many states parties have argued that Pillar 3 has not been given the same attention as the other elements of the treaty. Any balanced outcome from the 10th NPT Review Conference must rectify this situation. The growing focus on the beneficial applications of nuclear science and technology adds yet another layer of collective importance to the NPT, and by extension, to working tirelessly to produce a consensus outcome. As I noted, the list of issues I have just recited is a combination of what I have heard from state parties over the last 2 years and my own personal observations. Clearly, there are many potholes on the road to success, if not outright chasm to cross. Getting to the other side with a final outcome in our hands is going to be difficult, but not impossible. As I said at the beginning, the most important thing that has stood out to me throughout this never-ending tenure as President-designate has been the commitment of state parties to the NPT. When we talk about the need to find common ground, I think people forget that the NPT is common ground. Protecting it, keeping it fit for purpose, and making sure it can continue its role as a bastion of international peace and security is a priority for all. This is why, despite the current circumstances, I'm optimistic that the state parties will approach the review conference ready to actually negotiate, to collaborate and produce a meaningful outcome. It is important to remember that there is no template for a review conference outcome. Each successful conference has produced something different, from action plans to resolutions to full-fledged reviews. This gives these parties a certain level of flexibility when it comes to what an outcome from the 10th NPT review conference will look like. I hope they will take advantage of this. Of course, I'll be there to do my best to facilitate it. Let me close by once again thanking the INMM for the opportunity to speak to you today, but also by recalling that members of the Institute will not be sitting on the sidelines of the review conference. Many of you are integral to your government's delegations and positions. But the private sector and other organizations also have a role to play in urging state parties to broaden convergence and narrow divergence. I hope I can count on your support, and I thank you. Regarding the first question, and I have to say that in some ways, it is hard to believe that March 2020 was only 2 years ago. The world has changed a lot since then. The impact on the review conference has, I think, been mixed. On the one hand, the delay has provided the opportunity for an unprecedented level of consultations that have allowed the parties to air their positions and listen to those of others. Since 2020, we have also seen the extension of the New START, a statement by the nuclear weapon states confirming that a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must not be fought, and the recommencement of efforts to get the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Actions on Iran's nuclear program back on track. Now, on the other hand, it is inarguable that nuclear risks have risen. The war in Ukraine is in many ways the culmination of increasingly fraught relationship between nuclear weapon states, growing turbulence in the international system as the post-Cold War order evolves into something new, and decreasing level of trust and dialogue between governments. Regional issues have also become more acute. Those efforts to save the JCPOA seem to be stalled. North Korea appears to be once again moving in a dangerous situation. Despite this, I think the review conference is an opportunity to confront negative trends. It is the only forum in which all nuclear weapon states recognized under the NPT are engaging on these issues and should be leveraged as a rare chance to reduce nuclear risk. The key will be whether all state parties can rise to the occasion to turn the negative into the positive, and I believe they can. Regarding question 2, from the beginning of my tenure as President Designate of the review conference, I have said that a plurality of voices produces better results. I have been insistent that the review conference must be a venue for all stakeholders, a place for young people to have their say, for industry and civil society to be heard, and to ensure that we respect the principle of gender equality and parity. Bringing all these voices together is central to creating the next generation of nuclear practitioners across all 3 pillars of the NPT. We need to give youth the opportunity to engage with governments and industry, to let them see how the sausage is made and why the deliberations that take place during the NPT review cycle are important and not just endless speeches. Young people need to be provided with the opportunity to engage, to have their views heard, but also to listen to those who have accumulated experience in the field. They need to see why the issues under the purview of the NPT are critical not just to the world of today, but to the world of tomorrow, their world. This is not something that can be understood unless they are present in the room. I'm expecting them to be there. And regarding question 3, as I said, the war in Ukraine is a reflection of dangerous currents that have been flowing for some time now. The impact on the review conference has the potential to be deleterious, simply because the nuclear weapon states are no longer even consulting with each other en masse. Nuclear weapon states unity has been essential to every successful review conference in the past. If they are not talking, that unity will be hard to find. On the issue of nuclear weapons as a deterrent to more powerful neighbors, I think this is a disingenuous argument. It ignores the historical facts and complexity, for example, surrounding Ukraine and nuclear weapons. It is highly likely that had Ukraine elected to try and keep those nuclear weapons on its territory, it would have faced strong objections from the United States and Russian Federation, for example. I think it is highly likely that Ukraine would have been persuaded one way or the other to return the weapons. But more importantly, nuclear proliferation does not make anyone safer. That is the fundamental reasoning behind the NPT. Arguing otherwise undermines the treaty and the regime it upholds, the regime that has helped keep the world safe for more than 50 years. There are, however, two byproducts of the war in Ukraine that I think can be usefully discussed at the review conference. The first is the impact it has had on public awareness about nuclear risk and growing concerns as a result. The review conference should leverage this into a real conversation about practical near-term measures that can reduce the risk of nuclear war. And second, the issue of the safety and security of nuclear facilities in armed conflicts is unprecedented. The IAEA has put forward the 7 pillars concept, and I welcomed the DG's Gross's approach on this and his personal efforts on this, which I think is a useful platform to begin discussions at the conference on ways to address this issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Tariq, if you want to take the introduction.
Yes, thank you. So our final speaker in this closing session is Ms. Dominique Mouillot, who is the president of Women in Nuclear Global, WIN Global, which is a global nonprofit organization of women working professionally in various fields of nuclear energy and radiation applications. WIN currently has about 35,000 members, including chapters members and individuals from 129 countries. Ms. Mouillot is one of the most recognized women business leaders in the French nuclear sector. She started her professional career as a chemical research engineer at the CEA, the Commissariat à l'Énergie Atomique et aux Énergies Alternatives, leading projects for the French Ministry of Defense. Between 1979 and 1996, she held positions of product manager, as well as sales and marketing director in France and other countries, in the fields of nuclear engineering and systems of nuclear measures for the safety of facilities, workers, and populations. She also has held senior management positions in prominent groups. Currently, she's working for the Spanish group GD Energy Services, GDES, as vice president of GDES in France. Dominique has been involved in Women in Nuclear for over 20 years through different roles and positions. She was president of WIN France for more than 15 years, contributing to the development of the association and